I never believed in ghosts until I put on that wedding dress. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened to me in Salem, Massachusetts 3 months ago still haunts my dreams every single night. My name is Sarah, and I was planning what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. My fiancé Mark and I had been together for 5 years, and we'd finally set a date for our wedding in October. I'd been searching everywhere for the perfect vintage wedding dress, something with history, something unique that would make our special day even more memorable. Little did I know that I was about to find something with far more history than I could have ever imagined. It was a crisp Saturday morning in September when I decided to check out an estate sale in the historic district of Salem. The house was a beautiful Victorian mansion that had been in the Whitmore family for over a century. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had passed away the previous month at the age of 93, and her distant relatives were selling off decades of accumulated belongings. The moment I walked up those creaking wooden steps to the front porch, I felt something strange, a chill that seemed to come from nowhere, even though the sun was shining brightly overhead. Hit the like button if you're already getting chills from this story, because it only gets scarier from here. The inside of the house was like stepping back in time. Antique furniture filled every room, and the walls were covered with old family portraits whose eyes seemed to follow you as you moved through the space. There were other people browsing through the items, but I noticed that everyone spoke in hushed tones, as if the house itself demanded reverence and respect. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and I found myself taking shallow breaths as I made my way through the various rooms. I'd been searching through jewelry boxes and examining vintage china for about an hour when I decided to explore the second floor. The narrow staircase groaned under my weight, and with each step upward, the temperature seemed to drop by several degrees. At the top of the stairs, there was a long hallway lined with bedroom doors, but one room at the very end caught my attention immediately. Unlike the other rooms that had their doors propped wide open for browsers, this door was only slightly ajar, as if it were reluctant to reveal its secrets. When I pushed the door open, my breath caught in my throat. The room was clearly a bridal suite. There were vanity tables with ornate mirrors, hat boxes stacked in corners, and wardrobes that appeared to be filled with clothing from bygone eras. But what dominated the entire space was a single wedding dress hanging in the center of the room, displayed on a vintage dress form as if it were waiting for someone to claim it. The dress was absolutely breathtaking. It was made of ivory silk that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light filtering through the heavy curtains. The bodice was intricately beaded with pearls and tiny crystals, and the skirt flowed down in layers of delicate lace and tulle. The craftsmanship was exquisite, clearly handmade by someone with incredible skill and attention to detail. It looked like something a princess would wear, and I found myself drawn to it like a moth to flame. Comment below if you've ever felt inexplicably drawn to an antique object. I'd love to hear your experiences. As I stepped closer to examine the dress, I noticed a small placard next to it that read, "Wedding Dress of Victoria Whitmore, 1943. Never worn." Never worn? That seemed strange for such a beautiful gown. I looked around for someone to ask about the dress and its history, but the room was empty except for me. That should have been my first warning sign, but I was so captivated by the beauty of the dress that I ignored the growing sense of unease in my stomach. I reached out to touch the fabric, and the moment my fingers made contact with the silk, everything changed. The room suddenly became ice cold, so cold that I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The sensation was so sudden and intense that I jerked my hand back, but the cold seemed to follow me, wrapping around my body like invisible chains. For just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something, a whisper so faint that I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded unmistakably like a woman's voice. I shook my head, trying to clear the strange sensations, and told myself that it was just my imagination running wild. Old houses often felt cold and creaky, and the romantic atmosphere of finding a vintage wedding dress was probably just making me overly emotional. But even as I tried to rationalize what had happened, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone in that room anymore. Despite the strange experience, or perhaps because of it, I knew I had to have that dress. It was perfect, exactly what I'd been searching for, and the price tag of $300 was incredibly reasonable for such a stunning vintage piece. I found the family member who was handling the sale transactions, a nervous-looking woman in her 40s who introduced herself as Patricia, Eleanor's great-niece. When I mentioned that I was interested in purchasing the wedding dress, Patricia's face went pale, and she glanced around nervously before leaning in closer to me. "Are you sure about that dress?" she asked in a voice barely above a whisper. "There's something you should know about its history." I should have listened to her warning. I should have asked more questions, but I was so enchanted by the dress that I brushed off her concerns. "What do you mean?" I asked, but she just shook her head and muttered something about family stories and old superstitions. Let me know in the comments if you think I should have walked away right then. Maybe you're smarter than I was. Patricia reluctantly processed my payment, but as she wrapped the dress in tissue paper and placed it in a large garment bag, she kept glancing at me with an expression that I can only describe as pity mixed with fear. "Just be careful," she whispered as she handed me the bag. "And if anything strange happens, bring it back immediately." I thanked her and assured her that everything would be fine, but as I carried the dress out to my car, I couldn't help but notice how heavy it felt. Much heavier than a dress should be, as if it were weighted down with something invisible and substantial. The garment bag seemed to radiate cold even through the multiple layers of tissue paper, and by the time I reached my car, my hands were numb from carrying it. The drive home should have taken 30 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror at the garment bag hanging in the back seat, I felt that same inexplicable chill run down my spine. The radio kept cutting in and out with static, and at one point, I could have sworn I heard that same whispered voice coming through the speakers, though the words were too distorted to understand. When I finally arrived at my apartment, I carried the dress inside and hung it in my bedroom closet. As soon as I closed the closet door, the strange sensation seemed to fade, and I began to feel foolish for letting my imagination get the better of me. Mark was working late that evening, so I decided to surprise him by trying on the dress and sending him a photo. That was my second mistake. The first was buying the dress in the first place. As I carefully removed the wedding dress from its garment bag that evening, the fabric felt different than it had in the estate sale. Softer somehow, but also strangely warm, as if it had been hanging in direct sunlight all day. The intricate beadwork caught the light from my bedroom lamp and seemed to sparkle with an almost supernatural radiance. I laid the dress out on my bed and stepped back to admire it fully, and I have to admit, it was even more beautiful in my own space than it had been in that dim, cold room at the Whitmore house. I spent nearly an hour preparing for my private fitting session. I took a long shower, did my hair in a vintage-inspired updo, and even applied a full face of makeup as if I were actually walking down the aisle. Looking back now, I realized I was treating the dress with a level of reverence that bordered on worship, but at the time it felt natural and appropriate. This was going to be my wedding dress after all, and I wanted to see how I would look on my special day. When I finally slipped the dress over my head, the transformation was immediate and startling. The fit was absolutely perfect, as if the dress had been custom-made specifically for my body. The silk fell in all the right places, the bodice hugged my curves flawlessly, and the length was exactly right, even though I wasn't wearing heels. It was almost impossible to believe that a dress made in 1943 could fit me so perfectly without any alterations needed. Subscribe if you want to hear more supernatural stories like this one. There's so much more to tell. But as I stood in front of my full-length mirror, admiring how the dress looked, I began to notice subtle changes in my reflection. At first, I thought it was just the lighting or the way the vintage style was affecting my appearance, but the longer I stared at myself, the more pronounced the changes became. My skin looked paler, almost translucent, and my eyes seemed to have taken on a different quality, deeper, sadder, with dark circles underneath that I knew hadn't been there moments before. I blinked hard and shook my head, but when I looked in the mirror again, the changes were still there. Even more disturbing, my reflection seemed to be moving independently of my actual movements. When I raised my left hand to touch my face, my reflection raised its right hand. When I turned my head to the left, my reflection turned to the right. It was as if I were looking at someone else entirely, someone who was wearing my face, but wasn't me. The room had grown cold again, that same bone-deep chill I'd experienced at the estate sale, but this time it was accompanied by other sensations. I could smell something floral and sickly sweet, like funeral flowers that had been left out too long. There was also an underlying scent of something much less pleasant, something organic and decaying that made my stomach turn. The combination of the two smells was so overwhelming that I had to cover my nose with my hand to keep from gagging. That's when I heard her voice for the first time. Not just a whisper, but actual words, spoken clearly in my left ear as if someone were standing right behind me. "You look beautiful," the voice said, and it was definitely female, with a slight accent that I couldn't quite place. Almost as beautiful as I did. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. The door was still closed, the windows were shut, and there was absolutely no one there who could have spoken to me. But even as I tried to convince myself that I'd imagined the voice, I could feel a presence in the room with me. Something watching, waiting, evaluating. Comment below what you think was really happening. I'd love to hear your theories. I decided to take the dress off immediately, but when I reached behind my back to find the zipper, my fingers couldn't locate it. I twisted and contorted, trying to reach the closure, but it was as if the zipper had vanished completely. Panic began to set in as I realized I was trapped in the dress, and the panic only intensified when I looked in the mirror again and saw that my reflection was smiling. A cold, cruel smile that I definitely wasn't making. "Don't take me off," the voice said again, this time seeming to come from multiple directions at once. "I've been waiting so long to be worn again, so long to feel alive again." I grabbed at the fabric around my neck, trying to pull the dress off over my head, but the material wouldn't budge. It felt like it had somehow fused with my skin, becoming part of me rather than just clothing I was wearing. The beads and crystals that had looked so beautiful earlier now felt sharp against my skin, pressing into me like tiny needles. The more I struggled, the tighter the dress seemed to become, until I could barely breathe. The mirror reflection was no longer pretending to mimic my movements. The woman in the glass was moving independently now, reaching toward me with pale, skeletal fingers that pressed against the inside of the mirror as if trying to break through. Her face was gaunt and hollow, with sunken cheeks and eyes that had lost all color. Most terrifying of all, she was still wearing the same dress I had on, but in the reflection, the beautiful ivory silk had turned a sickly yellow color, and there were dark stains across the bodice that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "My name is Victoria," the voice continued, and now I could see that the reflection's mouth was moving in sync with the words. "Victoria Whitmore. This is my dress, and you're in my body." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the dress had stolen my voice along with my ability to remove it. The room spun around me, and I felt myself losing consciousness, but just before everything went black, I heard Victoria's voice one more time, clearer than ever. "Don't fight me, dear. We're going to be so happy together." When I woke up, I was lying on my bedroom floor, still wearing the dress. The sun was streaming through my window, indicating that I'd been unconscious all night. My body ached as if I'd been in a physical fight, and my throat was so dry I could barely swallow. But what frightened me most was that I couldn't remember anything after hearing Victoria's voice. There was a complete blank in my memory from that moment, until waking up on the floor. I struggled to my feet and looked in the mirror, expecting to see the same horrifying reflection from the night before. But everything appeared normal. I looked like myself again, tired and disheveled, but myself nonetheless. The dress, however, looked different in the morning light. The ivory silk had faded to a duller shade, and several of the beads and crystals were missing, leaving small holes in the fabric where they had been attached. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced memory blackouts during supernatural encounters. This time, when I reached for the zipper, I found it immediately, and the dress slipped off easily. I threw it into the back of my closet and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I got dressed in my normal clothes. I tried to convince myself that everything that had happened was just a stress-induced nightmare. Wedding planning could be overwhelming after all, and I'd probably just had a psychological reaction to the pressure. But throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every reflective surface, windows, the bathroom mirror, even the screen of my phone when it was turned off, seemed to show something just slightly wrong with my reflection. Sometimes it was just a different expression on my face, sometimes it was the way my hair fell, but there was always something that made me do a double take. Mark came home that evening and immediately commented on how tired I looked. "Did you not sleep well last night?" he asked, and I realized I couldn't tell him the truth. How could I explain that I thought I'd been possessed by the ghost of a woman who died over 80 years ago? He would think I was having a mental breakdown. "I tried on the wedding dress," I said instead. "I think I might have had an allergic reaction to the old fabric or something." Mark looked concerned and suggested I take the dress to a dry cleaner to have it properly cleaned and sanitized. "Old clothes can harbor all kinds of bacteria and allergens," he said reasonably. "Once it's been professionally cleaned, you'll probably be fine." That night, I kept my bedroom door open and left all the lights on, but I still couldn't sleep. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear sounds coming from my closet, rustling fabric, the gentle jingling of beads, and underneath it all, the soft sound of someone humming a wedding march. When I finally worked up the courage to open the closet door and check, everything looked normal, but the dress had somehow moved from the back of the closet to the front, hanging prominently where I couldn't miss it. By the third night, the humming had been joined by other sounds, footsteps pacing back and forth across my bedroom floor, the sound of someone trying on jewelry, and occasionally soft sobbing that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. I started sleeping on the couch in my living room, but even there, I could hear Victoria's voice calling to me from the bedroom, pleading with me to put the dress on again. "I just want to feel beautiful one more time," she would whisper. "I just want to have my wedding day. Please, Sarah, help me have my wedding day." By the end of the first week, I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Victoria wasn't just a figment of my imagination or a stress-induced hallucination. She was real. She was in my apartment, and she was growing stronger every day. The supernatural activity had escalated beyond simple sounds and whispers to full physical manifestations that I could no longer rationalize away. It started with objects moving on their own. I would come home from work to find my makeup arranged on my vanity table, as if someone had been experimenting with different looks. Lipstick tubes would be uncapped and used, leaving traces of colors I didn't even own on tissues scattered around the mirror. My jewelry box would be open with pieces laid out in careful arrangements, and my hair accessories would be moved from their usual places to create elaborate displays on my dresser. Hit that subscribe button if you're brave enough to keep following this terrifying story. But the most disturbing discovery was in my closet. The wedding dress had begun to change position almost daily. Sometimes I would find it hanging in the center of my closet with all my other clothes pushed to the sides, as if it were holding court over my entire wardrobe. Other times, it would be laid out carefully on my bed when I came home, arranged as if an invisible person were lying in it. The fabric always felt warm to the touch, regardless of how cold my apartment was, and the beadwork seemed to have been restored. Those missing crystals and pearls had somehow reappeared overnight, looking as pristine as they had the day I bought the dress. The mirror incidents became more frequent and more terrifying. Victoria's reflection would appear at random times throughout the day, not just when I was looking for her. I would catch glimpses of her in store windows while I was shopping, in the rearview mirror of my car while I was driving, and most unnervingly, in the black screen of my television when it was turned off. She was always wearing the wedding dress, and she was always trying to communicate with me, her mouth moving silently as if she were speaking words I couldn't hear. One evening, while I was trying to work on wedding invitations at my kitchen table, Victoria appeared in the reflection of my laptop screen. This time, however, I could hear her clearly, as if she were sitting right across from me. "Why won't you wear me again?" she asked, her voice filled with a desperate longing that made my heart ache despite my fear. "I showed you how beautiful you could be. I showed you how perfect we could be together." I closed the laptop immediately, but her voice continued to echo through my apartment. "I never got to have my wedding, Sarah. Edmund was killed in the war just 3 days before our ceremony. I died of a broken heart, still wearing my nightgown, still waiting for him to come home. But in my dress, I can feel what it would have been like. Through you, I can finally walk down the aisle." Comment below if you think I should have felt sorry for her. Was I being cruel by refusing to help? That night, I decided to do some research on Victoria Whitmore and the history of the dress. I spent hours searching through online archives, old newspaper records, and historical society documents, and what I found made my blood run cold. Victoria Whitmore had indeed died in 1943, just 3 days before her scheduled wedding to Edmund Crawford, a soldier who had been killed in action in Italy. But according to the records I found, Victoria hadn't died of a broken heart. She had died by suicide, hanging herself in her bedroom while wearing her wedding dress. The newspaper article from 1943 was brief, but chilling. "Local woman takes own life after receiving news of fiancé's death in war." Victoria Whitmore, 22, was found deceased in her bedroom by family members who had become concerned when she failed to respond to their calls. The wedding dress she had planned to wear was found cut from her body and carefully preserved by the family, who stated that Victoria had spent her final hours speaking to the dress as if it were a person. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling as the implications sank in. Victoria hadn't just died while wearing the dress, she had somehow transferred her essence into it during her final moments. The dress wasn't just haunted, it was a spiritual prison that had contained Victoria's soul for over 80 years. As if she could sense that I had discovered her secret, Victoria's presence became more aggressive immediately after I finished reading the article. The temperature in my apartment dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the inside of my windows. Every light in the place began flickering rapidly, creating a strobe effect that made me dizzy and disoriented. The sounds that had been subtle whispers and gentle movements became violent crashes and banging, as if an invisible person were throwing furniture around my rooms. "You know the truth now." Victoria's voice boomed through my apartment, no longer the sad, pleading tone she had used before. "You know what I need from you. "Put on the dress, Sarah. Let me have my wedding day and then I'll leave you alone." But I had read enough about supernatural possession to know that entities don't simply leave you alone once they get what they want. Victoria had been trapped in that dress for 8 decades, growing more desperate and more powerful with each passing year. If I put on the dress again and allowed her to fully possess me, there was no guarantee that she would ever let me go. Let me know in the comments if you would have tried to help her or protected yourself. I called in sick to work the next day and spent the morning researching everything I could find about spiritual cleansing and supernatural protection. I bought sage, holy water, protective crystals, and every other item that multiple sources recommended for dealing with malevolent spirits. I was determined to cleanse my apartment and send Victoria to whatever afterlife she was supposed to be in. But Victoria had other plans. The moment I lit the first bundle of sage, every window in my apartment slammed open simultaneously, creating a wind tunnel that blew out the flame and scattered the ashes throughout my living room. When I tried to sprinkle the holy water around my bedroom, the bottle cracked in my hands, sending glass shards and blessed water across my floor. The protective crystals I had carefully arranged around my apartment were found the next morning lined up in a perfect circle around the wedding dress, as if Victoria had corrupted them for her own use. It was clear that Victoria was far more powerful than I had realized, and that she had no intention of being banished easily. But the most terrifying realization came when I looked in my bathroom mirror that evening and saw that my reflection was beginning to change again, even when I wasn't wearing the dress. My features were becoming more angular, more like Victoria's, and my eyes had developed that same hollow, desperate look I had seen in her ghostly image. "You can't fight me forever," Victoria whispered from the mirror. "I'm already inside you, Sarah. Every day you resist me, I become stronger and you become weaker. Soon you won't be able to tell where you end and I begin." That night, I woke up to find myself standing in front of my closet, my hand reaching for the wedding dress. I had no memory of getting out of bed or walking to the closet, and I was terrified to realize that Victoria was beginning to control my actions even when I was unconscious. I backed away from the closet slowly, but I could feel her presence following me, could feel her will pressing against my mind like a physical weight. "Just once more," Victoria pleaded, her voice echoing inside my head now instead of coming from external sources. "Put me on just once more, and I promise I'll show you things that will make you never want to take me off again. I'll show you what it feels like to be truly beautiful, truly powerful, truly loved." I spent the rest of the night sitting in my living room with every light on, drinking coffee and fighting the overwhelming urge to go back to my bedroom and put on that dress. But even as I resisted her influence, I could feel Victoria's presence growing stronger, and I knew that I was running out of time. Soon she would be powerful enough to possess me completely, dress or no dress, and when that happened, Sarah would cease to exist entirely. I needed help, and I needed it fast. But who was going to believe a story about a possessed wedding dress? How could I explain what was happening without sounding like I was having a complete psychological breakdown? As I sat there in my living room, watching the sun rise through my frost-covered windows, I realized that I was completely alone in this fight, and Victoria knew it. "That's right, my dear," her voice whispered mockingly in my ear. "There's no one who can help you now. It's just you and me, and I've had 80 years to perfect my power. How long do you really think you can resist?" The breaking point came on a Friday night, exactly 2 weeks after I had brought the cursed dress into my home. I had been fighting Victoria's influence for days, barely sleeping, barely eating, and my body was beginning to show the strain. I had lost weight, my skin had taken on a pale, almost translucent quality, and dark circles under my eyes made me look like I was already halfway to being a ghost myself. Mark had been asking questions about my appearance and behavior, but I kept making excuses, terrified that if I told him the truth, he would think I was losing my mind. That evening, Mark was attending his bachelor party, a simple dinner with his groomsmen, and I was alone in the apartment for the first time in several days. I had been dreading this moment, knowing that Victoria's influence was always stronger when I was by myself, but I had hoped that I could make it through one night without incident. I was wrong. Subscribe if you want to hear how this supernatural nightmare finally reached its terrifying climax. The moment Mark's car pulled out of the parking lot, every electronic device in my apartment began to malfunction simultaneously. The television turned on by itself and began cycling rapidly through channels, creating a chaotic mixture of sounds and images that made my head spin. My stereo system started playing music that cut in and out with bursts of static, and the volume would suddenly spike to painful levels before dropping to barely audible whispers. Even my phone began acting strangely, sending text messages to random contacts with words I had never typed. Help me. I'm trapped. And most disturbing of all, the wedding is tonight. But the electronics were just the beginning. The physical manifestations that followed were unlike anything I'd experienced before. Furniture began sliding across my floors on its own, rearranging itself into patterns that resembled a wedding ceremony setup. My dining room chairs were pushed into neat rows facing my bedroom, as if creating an aisle for a bride to walk down. My coffee table was moved to the front of this improvised chapel and decorated with flowers that had appeared from nowhere. Wilted, brown flowers that smelled of decay and filled my apartment with the sickening sweet scent of a funeral home. The temperature dropped so rapidly that ice began forming on every surface in my apartment. My breath came out in thick white clouds, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, making my movements sluggish and my thoughts fuzzy. The cold wasn't just physical, it was supernatural, the kind of bone-deep chill that comes from proximity to death itself. "It's time, Sarah," Victoria's voice echoed through my apartment, no longer coming from mirrors or electronics, but seeming to emanate from the very walls themselves. "It's time for our wedding. I've waited 80 years for this day, and I won't wait any longer." I tried to run toward my front door, desperate to escape the apartment and get help, but my legs wouldn't obey my commands. I looked down in horror to see that I was walking in the opposite direction, toward my bedroom, my feet moving against my will. Victoria was controlling my body now, overriding my conscious decisions and forcing me to do her bidding. "Don't fight me," Victoria's voice said, but now it seemed to be coming from inside my own head, as if she were speaking with my voice. "This will be so much easier if you don't fight me. Comment below if you've ever felt like you weren't in control of your own body. This was the most terrifying part." Step by step, I was forced to walk toward my bedroom, and with each movement, I could feel Victoria's presence growing stronger inside my mind. My thoughts began to blur together with hers, my memories mixing with her memories until I couldn't tell which experiences belonged to whom. I could see flashes of her life, her childhood in the Victorian mansion, her romance with Edmund, the devastating moment when she received news of his death, and the dark despair that had driven her to take her own life. But I could also feel her accessing my memories, learning everything about my life, my relationship with Mark, my hopes and dreams for our future together. She was studying me, learning how to be me, preparing to take over my existence completely. When I reached my bedroom, the door slammed shut behind me with such force that the frame cracked. The wedding dress was no longer hanging in my closet. It was laid out on my bed, glowing with an otherworldly light that made the beadwork sparkle like stars. But this wasn't the beautiful dress I had fallen in love with at the estate sale. This was the dress as it truly was, yellowed with age, stained with the marks of Victoria's death, and radiating a malevolent energy that made my soul recoil in horror. "Put me on!" Victoria commanded, and I felt my hands reaching for the dress despite every instinct in my body screaming at me to stop. Against my will, my fingers closed around the fabric of the dress, and I felt Victoria's triumph surge through both of our minds like electricity. The moment the dress touched my skin, the transformation began immediately. I could feel Victoria's consciousness flooding into my body, pushing my own thoughts and memories into dark corners of my mind, where I could only observe helplessly as she took control. My reflection in the mirror showed the horrifying merger taking place. My features were morphing and shifting, becoming more angular and gaunt, while my eyes took on the hollow, desperate look that belonged to a woman who had been dead for 80 years. "Finally," Victoria whispered through my lips, her voice mixing with mine until I couldn't tell where she ended and I began. "Finally, I can have my wedding day." My hands moved without my permission, lifting the dress and beginning to slip it over my head. With each inch of fabric that touched my skin, I could feel more of myself disappearing. Victoria's memories became clearer and more vivid than my own. I could smell the flowers that had been arranged for her canceled wedding, feel the devastating grief when she received news of Edmund's death, experience the cold rope around her neck in those final moments of despair. But I could also feel her accessing my memories with Mark, corrupting them, twisting our love story into something dark and possessive. She was planning to take over my life completely, to marry Mark while wearing my body like a costume, and the thought of her touching him with my hands, kissing him with my lips, filled me with a rage that cut through her supernatural influence. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had to fight for control of your own mind. This was the battle of my life. "No," I managed to whisper, and for a moment, Victoria's control slipped. The dress stopped its upward movement, hanging half on, half off my body. "This is my life, my body, my wedding." "You're dead, Victoria. You've been dead for 80 years, and you need to accept that." Victoria's fury was immediate and overwhelming. The temperature in the room plummeted even further, and every piece of glass in my bedroom, the mirror, picture frames, even my water glass on the nightstand, began to crack and splinter. The sound was deafening, like the house itself was screaming in pain. "I won't let you have what I was denied," Victoria shrieked, her voice echoing from every surface in the room. "If I can't be happy, then no one can be happy. I'll destroy your life just like mine was destroyed." The battle for control of my body intensified. One moment I would be trying to pull the dress off, the next my hands would be smoothing it down and adjusting the fit. Victoria was stronger than me. She had decades of supernatural energy built up, but I had something she didn't. I was still alive, still connected to the physical world in ways that she could never be again. I thought about Mark, about our plans for the future, about the life we were going to build together. I thought about all the people who loved me and would be devastated if Victoria succeeded in taking over my existence. Most importantly, I thought about the fact that Victoria had chosen death over life 80 years ago, and I refused to let her decision become mine. Comment below what you would have done in this terrifying situation. I needed all the strength I could get. Drawing on every ounce of willpower I possessed, I grabbed the neckline of the dress and pulled with all my strength. The fabric, which had seemed indestructible moments before, began to tear. As it ripped, Victoria's screams intensified, but I could feel her hold on me weakening. Each thread that broke was like cutting the chains that bound us together. "You're destroying me," Victoria wailed, but her voice was becoming fainter, more distant. "Without the dress, I'll fade away completely. I'll be nothing." "You were already nothing," I gasped as I continued tearing at the fabric. "You chose to be nothing when you took your own life instead of living it. I won't make that same choice." The dress came apart in my hands, and as the last threads separated, Victoria's presence was suddenly gone. The oppressive cold lifted, the supernatural sounds stopped, and I was alone in my bedroom, surrounded by scraps of yellowed silk and tarnished beads. The mirror showed only my own reflection, pale, exhausted, but unmistakably me. I gathered up every piece of the destroyed dress and carried them outside to my apartment building's dumpster. As I threw the remnants away, I could have sworn I heard Victoria's voice one last time, faint and fading. "This isn't over, Sarah. Death is patient, and I'll find another way." But I knew that it was over. I had broken the connection between us, destroyed the physical anchor that had allowed her to influence the living world. Whatever power Victoria had possessed died with that dress, and she would have to face whatever judgment awaited her in the afterlife she had been avoiding for so long. The next morning, I woke up feeling like myself for the first time in weeks. The apartment felt warm and normal, my reflection looked healthy and human, and the oppressive sense of being watched had completely disappeared. I called Mark and told him that I had decided to buy a new wedding dress, something modern, something that belonged only to me and to our future together. He was confused by my sudden change of heart, but he didn't question it. "Whatever makes you happy," he said, and I realized that happiness was exactly what Victoria had tried to steal from me. She had been so consumed by her own grief and anger that she couldn't bear to see others experience the joy she had been denied. But in the end, love was stronger than death, and life was stronger than the desperate clinging of those who had chosen to leave it behind. Share this video if you believe that love can overcome supernatural evil. We all need that reminder sometimes. The weeks that followed my confrontation with Victoria were a period of healing and recovery that I hadn't expected to need. While I had successfully banished her spirit and destroyed the dress that served as her anchor to our world, the psychological trauma of being possessed left scars that took time to heal. I found myself jumping at unexpected sounds, checking mirrors obsessively to make sure my reflection was truly my own, and struggling with nightmares that blended my memories with Victoria's tragic history. Mark noticed the changes in me immediately, though I still couldn't bring myself to tell him the complete truth about what had happened. Instead, I explained that I had experienced what I called a spiritual crisis while planning our wedding, and that I needed some time to process my feelings about marriage, commitment, and the weight of family traditions. It wasn't exactly a lie. I had indeed experienced a spiritual crisis, just not the kind that most people would understand or believe. To his credit, Mark was incredibly patient and supportive during this difficult period. He suggested that we postpone our wedding by a few months to give me time to work through whatever I was experiencing, and he even offered to attend counseling sessions with me if that would help. His understanding and love during those dark weeks reminded me why I had fought so hard to retain control of my own life and future. Hit the like button if you think Mark was the kind of partner everyone deserves during a crisis. I did end up seeking professional help, though I was careful about how much I revealed to my therapist. Dr. Rebecca Martinez was a licensed psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery, and she helped me work through what she understood to be a severe anxiety episode, triggered by wedding stress. While I couldn't tell her about Victoria's supernatural possession, I was able to discuss the feelings of helplessness, loss of control, and identity confusion that had resulted from the experience. Sometimes when we're facing major life transitions, Dr. Martinez explained during one of our sessions, our minds can create elaborate scenarios that represent our deepest fears about losing ourselves or being consumed by expectations that don't belong to us. Your experience with the vintage wedding dress might have been your psyche's way of processing anxiety about living up to family traditions or losing your individual identity within marriage. Her explanation made sense from a psychological perspective, and it gave me a framework for understanding my experience that didn't require believing in supernatural possession. Whether Victoria had been a real ghost or a manifestation of my own subconscious fears, the important thing was that I had found the strength to fight for my autonomy and my right to choose my own path in life. Let me know in the comments if you think my therapist's explanation made sense or if you believe Victoria was real. 3 months after the incident, Mark and I went shopping for a new wedding dress together. This time, I chose a modern gown from a contemporary designer, something that had never been worn by anyone else, something that carried no history or emotional baggage from previous owners. The dress was beautiful in its simplicity, with clean lines and minimal embellishment that reflected my own personality rather than trying to live up to some idealized vision of what a bride should be. As I stood in the bridal shop fitting room, looking at myself in the mirror wearing a dress that was truly mine, I felt a sense of peace and ownership over my own image that I hadn't experienced since before I brought Victoria's dress into my life. My reflection looked back at me with clear, healthy eyes, and my skin had regained its natural color and vitality. Most importantly, I looked like myself, not like someone trying to channel the ghost of a woman from another era. The fitting appointment was interrupted by an unexpected encounter that reminded me how far I had come in my recovery. As I was admiring the dress in the three-way mirror, another bride-to-be entered the fitting area wearing a vintage gown that looked remarkably similar to Victoria's dress. The moment I saw her, my heart began racing and my palms became sweaty. But instead of the overwhelming panic I might have experienced months earlier, I felt only a mild anxiety that I was able to manage through the breathing techniques Dr. Martinez had taught me. "That's a beautiful vintage piece," I commented to the other bride, testing my ability to engage with similar situations without being triggered. "Thank you," she replied with a radiant smile. "It belonged to my grandmother. She wore it at her wedding in 1945, and she always said it brought her incredible luck and happiness. She was married to my grandfather for 62 years before he passed away." The difference in our experiences was striking and healing for me to witness. This woman's vintage dress carried positive energy and beautiful family memories, proving that not all antique wedding gowns were cursed or haunted. Victoria's dress had been corrupted by tragedy and suicide, but that didn't mean all vintage clothing was dangerous. It was an important reminder that objects themselves aren't inherently evil. It's the energy and intentions that become attached to them that can make them harmful. Comment below if you've had positive experiences with vintage or antique items. I'd love to hear uplifting stories. Our wedding day, when it finally arrived in late spring, was everything I had dreamed it would be. The ceremony took place in a small chapel surrounded by gardens in full bloom, with only our closest family and friends in attendance. As I walked down the aisle in my modern, personally chosen dress, I felt completely present in my own body and completely certain of my decision to marry Mark. During the ceremony, there was a moment when I caught sight of my reflection in the chapel's stained glass windows, and for just an instant, I thought I saw something else, a faint, translucent figure standing behind me, wearing a tattered wedding dress, and watching the proceedings with a mixture of sadness and what might have been acceptance. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing there except my own image, radiant and alive and exactly where I was supposed to be. I chose to interpret that fleeting vision as Victoria's final farewell, her acknowledgement that I had made the choice she couldn't make, choosing life and love over despair and death. Perhaps in witnessing my happiness, she had finally found the peace that had eluded her for 80 years. Or perhaps it was simply my imagination, creating closure for a traumatic experience that my conscious mind still struggled to fully understand. The reception was filled with laughter, dancing, and the kind of joy that comes from celebrating love surrounded by people who genuinely care about your happiness. As Mark and I shared our first dance as husband and wife, I marveled at how different this felt from the cold, desperate energy I had experienced while wearing Victoria's dress. This was warm, genuine, and completely mine. Subscribe if you believe that choosing life and love is always the right decision, even when it's difficult. During our honeymoon in Italy, Mark and I had many long conversations about the changes I had gone through in the months before our wedding. I still didn't tell him about Victoria or the supernatural aspects of my experience, but I was able to share my struggles with identity, autonomy, and the pressure to live up to external expectations. He listened without judgment and shared his own fears about marriage and commitment, helping me realize that my crisis, whatever its true nature, had actually strengthened our relationship by forcing us both to examine what we really wanted from our life together. "I'm glad you took the time you needed to work through everything," he told me as we sat on a terrace overlooking the Mediterranean Sea. "The woman I married is stronger and more self-aware than the woman I proposed to, and I love seeing you so confident in who you are." His words reminded me that trauma, even supernatural trauma, doesn't have to define us or limit our capacity for growth and happiness. The experience with Victoria had been terrifying and invasive, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about the importance of fighting for my own identity and refusing to let anyone, living or dead, control my choices or my future. When we returned from our honeymoon, I made a decision that surprised even me. I began volunteering at a local crisis counseling center, helping people who were struggling with feelings of helplessness and loss of control. While I couldn't share the specific details of my own experience, I found that my hard-won understanding of what it meant to fight for your own autonomy was valuable in helping others who felt overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. The work was emotionally challenging but deeply rewarding. Many of the people I counseled were dealing with abusive relationships, family pressures, or major life transitions that made them feel like they were losing themselves. I was able to help them develop strategies for maintaining their sense of identity and agency, even in difficult circumstances. Let me know in the comments if you've ever found purpose in helping others through experiences similar to your own. 1 year after my encounter with Victoria, I received an unexpected phone call that brought my story full circle. It was Patricia, the woman who had sold me the wedding dress at the estate sale. She had somehow tracked down my contact information and wanted to apologize for not warning me more strongly about the dress's history. "I've been feeling guilty ever since you bought that dress," she confessed. "My great-aunt Eleanor told me stories about Victoria and what happened to her, but I thought they were just family legends. After you left that day, I kept thinking about how frightened you looked when you asked about the dress's history, and I should have insisted on telling you everything I knew." I assured Patricia that I didn't blame her for what had happened, and I was curious to learn more about Victoria's story from the family's perspective. According to Patricia, Victoria had indeed died by suicide in 1943, but the family had always believed that her spirit remained attached to the dress. Over the years, several family members had reported strange experiences when the dress was displayed in the house: cold spots, whispered voices, and the feeling of being watched. "My great-aunt Eleanor always said that Victoria was still searching for her wedding day," Patricia explained. She believed that Victoria's spirit would only find peace when she was finally able to experience the joy of marriage that had been taken from her. But Eleanor also warned that Victoria had become twisted by decades of grief and anger, and that she might try to steal someone else's happiness if given the opportunity. This conversation provided me with a sense of closure and validation that I hadn't realized I needed. Knowing that Victoria's haunting had been a long-standing family concern, and that other people had experienced similar phenomena, helped me feel less isolated in my experience and more confident in my decision to destroy the dress. Share this story with someone who needs to hear about the power of fighting for your own identity and happiness. Looking back on my experience with Victoria's wedding dress, I've come to understand it as a profound lesson about the difference between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it. Vintage and antique items can carry beautiful history and positive energy when they come from places of love and happiness, but objects that are tied to trauma, desperation, and unresolved grief can become conduits for negative influences that seek to drag the living into the same darkness that consumed their original owners. More importantly, my encounter with Victoria taught me that we always have the power to choose life over death, hope over despair, and love over fear. Victoria had allowed her grief to consume her so completely that she lost sight of all the beauty and possibility that still existed in the world, even after her devastating loss. While I can't judge her for the choice she made in 1943, the trauma of losing a loved one in wartime was unimaginably difficult. I could refuse to let her despair become mine. Today, Mark and I have been happily married for 3 years, and we're expecting our first child. Sometimes, when I'm decorating the nursery or planning for our growing family, I think about Victoria and wonder if she has finally found the peace that eluded her for so long. I hope that by witnessing true love and choosing life over death, she was able to release the anger and grief that had trapped her spirit for decades. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. No matter how lost or powerless you might feel, you always have the choice to fight for your own happiness and autonomy. Whether the forces trying to control you are supernatural entities, abusive relationships, family expectations, or your own inner demons, you have the strength to resist and reclaim your life. It might not be easy, and you might need help along the way, but the choice to live authentically and love fully is always worth fighting for. The supernatural world may be more real than most people want to believe, but so is the power of human resilience, love, and the unbreakable will to survive and thrive. In the end, that's what saved me from Victoria's influence, and it's what continues to guide me toward a future filled with genuine happiness and authentic love. Comment below if this story has inspired you to fight for your own happiness, and remember to subscribe for more true supernatural encounters that prove the power of choosing life over death, love over fear, and hope over despair. The spirit world may be mysterious and sometimes dangerous, but the living world is full of infinite possibilities for those brave enough to claim them.